What's going on, guys? Phil Birch here from Unfun Stuff, coming at you with another episode of How to Get Away with Meta. This episode, we are going to be talking about Tokoyami, who I know I haven't made a video about yet, and is honestly a pretty impactful part of the meta. So let's go a little bit over, I guess, the state of Tokoyami in Set 2, uh, My Hero Academia Crimson Rampage, right? So in set one, Tokoyami was a very consistent contender post Kirishima 1 errata. He was showing up at the decks at tournaments at a pretty high frequency just because of the ease of play and the ease of the play pattern. It wasn't really super complicated. It wasn't something big and like unique and like a lot of thought required. It was pretty much draw Dark Shadow Ruins, play Dark Shadow Ruins, and hope that your assortment of other ranged attacks could get you there as well. With the introduction of Set 2 of the My Hero Academia collectible card game, Tokoyami took a little bit more of a step forward, just in the way that he gets to interact a little bit more with his opponent's board. Cards like Hellfire Javelin have been a very big impact on the playstyle of the character, as well as other cards that would really increase more of the damage potential, such as Revel and his Masterpiece. Those two cards alone added a little bit of an extra bonus, but you then get in cards like Forcing Surrender to really protect yourself from disruption, and you were adding yourself another level, right? Because a big part of Tokoyami's weakness would be having cards stuffed into his card pool with like sticky balls and such, right? To really increase the difficulty of his turn. Now with proper usage of Forcing Surrender and your own mill abilities, you can kind of manipulate the top card of your discard pile to not be an attack, so that your opponent can't necessarily sticky balls in something that you cannot remove. Along with the introduction of those couple of cards within the set, we were also shown Sugar Rush Power Up. This guy was introduced in the set as well as a promo. This is a promo box topper in Crimson Rampage, one of the many quirk pack cards, and this one really takes Tokoyami's playstyle from drawing the necessary pieces to allowing him to have an additional bump to really end the game. Right, this card is basically a really small attack. You pack a small attack's stats onto another one of your attacks at the cost of removing 10 cards from your discard pile. Not only does it do that, it also gave Tokoyami a sort of pseudo answer to Creepy Realization, which was his probably hardest card to play against. Yes, the people with Creepy Realization can have answers to Sugar Rush Power Up, but you can have answers to the answers, to the answers, to the answers, etc., etc., etc. This is just another tool that Tokoyami has in his arsenal to point and remove, basically, or turn off one of your opponent's options to stay alive. And since Creepy Realization was one of the big methods for them to stay alive, it is huge. Honestly, it's a really big effect for him to have gained, in addition to the fact that people are just jamming a ton of these into their bird decks just to end the game as fast as possible. Because it is very, very easy to activate this card on turn 2 playing Tokoyami. You build 4 or 5 on your first turn. You play a card, you mill 5 off the top with Tokoyami, add in a little bit of extra mill with like Revel or stuff like that, and voila, you are already activating Sugar Rush Power Up basically instantly. Now, Tokoyami has had kind of I wouldn't call it a super big resurgence, but he did kind of burst onto the scene. So at the Las Vegas Regional, he obviously won the entire event. There were a handful of birds there, myself and Ben Shoemaker included, both going 5 and 3. Tim Keefe making top cuts, and I'm sure there were a smattering of other birds across the tables. Tim was able to navigate what would, in my opinion, be a very tough field for Tokoyami, because there were a very, very large number of Moneta 2s and like other decks that deal with Tokoyami, not necessarily like super efficiently, but like they can survive his turn. they can clog up his turn, make it a little bit harder. But also, one of his big matchups really wasn't, one of his bad matchups, in my opinion, wasn't really there. Asui didn't particularly show up for the Las Vegas event at all. There really was a very low count on the Asui players. So Tim Keefe is able to power himself through a bunch of decks trying to go to longer, later games and play a little bit slower of a strategy. And that kind of propelled him through success because those decks aren't necessarily prepared to deal with a smattering of aggression on turn 2, turn 3, and then a solid late game with Tim Keefe's deck. We move on to the Columbus Regional at Origins, and we see just a ton of Tokoyami. I'm talking Tokoyami's at top tables, bottom tables, middle tables. Tokoyami's everywhere. At one point, I looked around me and I was surrounded by birds. I was playing against the Tokoyami. They were both on either sides, basically. There were tons and tons and tons. But we don't necessarily see the same showing, right? We got Jacob Johnson, who ends up making top 4 of the event. He wins his first round of Swiss against the Giro, or his first round of top cuts against Giro, and he's playing again a iteration of Tim Keefe's deck, maybe changing a few cards. So far we've seen Tokoyami win in a regional. We've seen him top 4 a regional, and then we move on over to the Orlando regional. Once again, we move on over to Orlando, and we see Tim Keefe once again having success with Tokoyami. So let's pull up his list here. Now this is Tim Keefe's Orlando top 8 Tokoyami deck. He lost to Travis. I know that he had said personally that he made a couple of misplays, and I heard it through the grapevine that he didn't deadlock enhance on Ice Storm when he should have. But that's okay. Hey, mistakes happen, and that's fine and dandy. But what we are seeing is that Tokoyami is not necessarily being the most represented at this event. This is an event that has a ton of Jiros, a ton of Ochakos, a ton of Kirishima. Like a lot of the bigger 6-hand size characters that could just go through and push through the strong defenses that people are playing and potentially get an extra turn survival against some of the aggro stuff like Fourth Kind and like Tokoyami. That's what they're hoping for. But obviously, once again, Tim Keefe, the amazing player that he is able to kind of transcend that. And that kind of brings me to what the next thing I want to talk about, and that is the differences between the way Tim Keefe plays this deck and then other people play this deck. So we have I think what has been commonly referred to, at least I am referring it to, as Dumb Bird versus Smart Bird. So Dumb Bird is it's what I played and what Ben Shoemaker played in Vegas. It is a 50 card list. It is Tall Bird. You're trying to make attacks as big as humanly possible. You're putting a lot of 1s and 0s or 1s and 2s on your attacks. You're using Revel. You're using all these extra cards for +1 damage at the cost of milling yourself, and you're just throwing Sugar Rush power up on basically everything. But you're doing that at the cost of playing cards that can basically save your game plan, right? You have very bad matchups within the meta, and that's simply how that deck is going to roll. It is going to have very high highs and very low lows if your opponent can answer and respect your offense. It's a deck that has a much harder time dealing with water decks, dealing with cards like with Mineta, dealing with Asui. It doesn't have a lot of stun. It doesn't have a lot of targeted committal. It doesn't have a lot of sealing with Irrefutable. And then you have Smart Bird. Smart Bird is the Tim Keefe bird. This is Tim Keefe's wet dream of a deck, right? He gets to point and tap all of your cards selectively with Hellfire Javelins at a certain point in the game. He gets to use Irrefutable Force of Nature as a 4-of to seal his problems. He plays cards like Evil Gaze, like Sugar Rush Power Up to even further deal with problems within the matchups. And it's a wonderful deck because it both is a very aggressive, very scary kill you on turn 2 deck, but also it has a living late game where you can actually feel like you stand a chance past turn 2 or turn 3. And piloted by a very smart player like Tim Keefe, it's covering block zones. It's blocking very well. It's not only blocking mid like traditionally a Tokoyami does. It's well thought out. It's well put together. And as you can see, it's showing results. It is a deck with longevity. It is something that people need to be worried about, need to look through, need to look at because it's scary. And it needs to honestly be in your consideration for a top deck of the meta, because if you can't deal with him selectively dealing with your cards, right? Like if you have no answers or not enough answers for cards like Hellfire Javelin or Irrefutable Force of Nature, you're going to have a very tough time late game against him or against anybody playing Smartbird. Now let's just go over kind of to wrap everything up, put it all in a nice little package, tie a bow on it. The strengths and weaknesses of the character, in my opinion. I know this is a weird thing to put at the end, but I think it really is going to encapsulate how I feel about the character. The character obviously is a very, very strong, straightforward, aggressive character. You're sending your own deck to the discard pile, so you have more options for cards like Frigid Heatwave. You're finding your Summon Dark Shadows very quickly. You're drawing cards. You're filtering, and you're making attacks that are very tall and wide. Right? You're going tall and wide. Your attacks get to be upwards of like 10 damage very, very easily, very, very forgivingly, and you're throwing 4 to 5 of them typically on a good turn, right? Like that is a very good Tokoyami turn, is 4 to 5 attacks, and they're all doing about 10 damage. That's scary to deal with. That's hard to deal with. That is the biggest strength of the character. He gets to put his abilities, just like obviously the synergy within them, right? Like you're filtering for your action. The action taps your character. Your character's putting more damage on. The action's already putting damage on. You have foundations that are putting damage on. You have abilities on the own cards putting damage on. Like, he just is damage. He is just damage. But you're also getting the ability to stun your opponent very easily. You're getting to target selectively, turn cards off. It's remarkable. And you're playing Sugar Rush power-ups and cards like that at a very easy clip, where some decks might struggle and have to play them a little bit later in the game when they're less effective. I do think that the character has weaknesses though, and I am pretty positive it's mostly related to the water symbol. I think the water symbol does give this guy a little bit of fits. The water symbol is incredible at blocking, particularly Asui in general. But not to say that Mineta 2 couldn't also do this. You're getting the ability to really hinder his ability to hit you if you can block a couple of times, right? If you get 2 blocks to 3 blocks, you have basically negated his whole turn, right? Yes, he can still potentially kill you with 2 attacks, but like that means you get a backswing. That means he's probably overextending, because the fire symbol doesn't have a lot of the cards that re-ready itself like a lot of the other symbols do in the meta. So this character is a very explosive offensive turns, but also if they go too deep and you are able to stay alive, they've probably tapped most of, if not all, their board. So it's back swingable for sure. I think Mineta can deal with him particularly well because he has a lot of life and he has great access to the water cards and blocks. And if he ever gets momentum, that means he's making one of these very, very scary moves like 0 speed, right? It's very easy for him to block then. He might not necessarily have the same explosive ability to kill Tokoyami as like an Asui, but he does get to sit nicely in that like sector, right? Another bad matchup for him is Kurogiri. Kurogiri can wait a little bit on his own ability and wait for Tokoyami to get a little bit deeper into his string when he actually has to play on a progressive, or you can always just send their Dark Shadow Rune to the bottom and make it so they have to have 2. It forces your opponent to have it, right? Like Kurogiri puts your opponent in a state if you're playing Tokoyami where they have to have the good ones and multiple copies of them, because dissolving the conflict is also going to take away the +3 to your check, because it's after the attack is played, it bounces it back. So he's got to play a little bit more honestly into Kurogiri, and that's not necessarily something Tokoyami wants to do. Again, it's hard to kill as Kurogiri, just like it's hard to kill as Mineta. So the Tokoyami does get more tries, but like they are more susceptible to milling themselves out, particularly if they're playing Dumb Bird. I would say the final weakness that I do think is going to be super prevalent in the meta, so it might turn people a little bit away from Tokoyami. Kirishima 2 seems like just not a great matchup for the character in general, right? You are able to have a bigger life as a 6-hand size character, right? You have more HP, and then you have the ability to partially block one of their attacks, which does negate basically one of their attacks, because Tokoyami isn't killing you by vast numbers, right? He isn't overkilling you by 20. He's usually killing you by 2 to 3. He's keeping it, it's very close typically if you're losing to Tokoyami, because unless it's just a blowout of game, right? Like he is a honest character in that regard, where his strings do damage, but they usually do enough damage to win. So with just like a couple of blocks and then a half block from Kirishima, like you've stopped their turn. You're making them play multiple turns of the game, which means that they are having a harder time playing the game. And that's kind of what you're looking for. Lots and lots of things like that play any sort of defense are horrible for the dumb bird players out there. Like if anybody's playing dumb bird, you are going to struggle a lot with any human being who knows how to play defense. Smart bird players, yeah, you're going to get a little bit more leeway, but it is still going to be tough if your opponent is capable of playing a good defense and has good high blocks and like potentially high blocks and like off-zone blocks in general, because you do find a couple of low attacks in the Tokoyamis these days. Anyway, guys, that is going to be my video, how to get away with meta on Tokoyami. I hope you all enjoyed it. Once again, leave me any questions and comments that you have, or any anecdotal evidence that is directly related to the character, and I'd be sure to read and respond. Thank you again for watching. Hit the like button, subscribe, turn the notifications on, and join me next week for another episode of How to Get Away with Meta.